and I would now like to hand over to our presenter for today, David Maxwell from Volunteer Glasgow, to start us off.
Thanks, David. Good to see a few familiar names, if not faces, so far. So thanks for having me, everybody. I'm going to share some slides initially and just talk you through some of the key points. I'm intending this to be hopefully a little bit interactive, but yeah, if you can put your questions in the chat for David and I to have a look at, we'll maybe spend up to 20 minutes or so just walking you through some of the key points, and then we'll have a Q&A hopefully, and cover as many of the questions as we possibly can before we finish it at well, about 5 to 3. 2 seconds in, I'll just share my slides. Okay. Is that shared okay? Everyone see that?
I can see from here, yeah.
Great, excellent. Okay. Okay, so briefly, what we're intending to try and cover today, the following 3 things. So yeah, definition of volunteering, including some of the intricacies of what it means according to the UK government to be volunteering or to be doing unpaid work, or indeed to be being paid, and some of the inherent risks of getting it wrong as volunteer managers or organisers might be. So we'll cover all of that under item 1. Item 2 is just to go over some of the key elements of the Department of Work and Pensions DWP rules on volunteering for welfare benefit or social security claimants. And finally, the third thing, just talk you through some of the things that you might want or indeed need to do to support people volunteering while they're claiming DWP UK benefits. So why me? Might be a good idea, good place to start. I was reminded last week, in fact, that I personally started doing work on this as early as 2013, when Glasgow's Poverty Leadership Panel first agreed an action being required as a priority in terms of volunteering for the DWP to actually clarify the rules. And it's very much, I guess, an ongoing piece of work that we have to do. And consequently, I've been involved, I guess, for the last 10 years in leading and facilitating a lot of the Scotland-wide conversations with DWP on volunteering. And we've benefited throughout that period, really, since certainly 2015-16, by having, I guess, a reasonably good, effective, productive working relationship with DWP in Scotland. In 2017, we kind of formally knocked together, I guess, an informal partnership agreement, but a written one nevertheless, between the TSI network in Scotland, which provides all the volunteer centre services in the country, one in each local authority area, and the DWP. So, as you might imagine, when the UK government changed in 2011, increasingly with welfare, so-called welfare reform, it became increasingly difficult to answer the question when we were asked, will volunteering affect my benefits? So that was clear nationally, and locally, as I said, the Poverty Leadership Panel were determined that we try to get DWP to clarify the rules as urgently as possible. One thing I would say is that, like most, if not all, TSI volunteer centre staff, we are not qualified or, formally we're not welfare rights officers. The one thing that we can do, however, is bridge that gap between expertise in volunteering and understanding the DWP rules in relation to volunteering specifically. So hopefully today we can, as I say, walk you through some of those and answer any questions you might have. cover some of the rest of the context. We were by 2017 able to invite people directly affected to co-design new guidance, which covered most of the questions that people were asked. And originally that was published in a frequently asked question format. That's no longer in use. It took a further 2 years for the DWP to publish that guidance, but in a slightly different format on gov.uk. So that's been freely available to everybody across the UK since then. We'll share the link in a moment in terms of, in case you've never seen that before. The guidance is largely positive. So, and one of the handouts we'll share is what we've developed with DWP and job centres in Scotland across the TSI Volunteer Centre network, which is a promotional leaflet, but specifically targeting people who are actively seeking paid employment, specifically about volunteering and the rules. And some of the key messages there from employers about the value of volunteering are all embedded in that. And yeah, largely very positive. However, a key fundamental question for anyone claiming a health or long-term condition disability benefit was the question of how volunteering might affect the outcome of a work capability assessment. And we'll cover that in a little bit more detail in a minute. We wanted to cover the definition of volunteering for everybody, in case that's not immediately obvious. It's something that everyone from the UN to UK government, Scottish government, Europe all have some form of volunteering definition, and I've laid that down somewhere. Top one there is the Scottish Government Volunteering for All framework definition, and the slightly lengthier, slightly more nuanced definition is from the United Nations Volunteering Programme. Fundamentally, however, across virtually every formal definition that you find across the globe, there's three key components. The activity has to benefit people outside your immediate family. It's unpaid, obviously, and people need to actively, freely choose to undertake the activity. Immeasurable, arguably priceless, but yeah, interesting use of language. And there's, if you haven't seen it before, there's a 2015 stat from the Bank of England at the bottom of that slide, obviously, around the value of volunteering. So we wanted to give you a flavour of some of the dangers around navigating your way around volunteer expenses, making sure that people aren't out of pocket, what constitutes unpaid work to the UK government. Why is there a difference? What that difference is. So I'll walk you through some of those things just now. What are the dangers? Well, what happens if you pay a volunteer something other than or more than what they are actually genuinely to the nearest penny out of pocket for? First of all, how would the DWP treat that? So if someone's claiming a DWP welfare benefit and you give them more than, strictly speaking, to the nearest penny, what they're out of pocket for, the DWP say that any money you are paid that is not to cover a reasonable expense may stop your benefit or reduce the amount you get. So a clear potential danger to your volunteers should they be claiming welfare benefits. And if your organisation group was to choose to essentially give them money for any amount other than what they're genuinely out of pocket for. The second inherent risk danger is to your organisation. If someone's paid anything other than out-of-pocket expenses, they could ostensibly, in theory, claim that they are being paid for their work and are therefore essentially in an employment contract, and entitled to minimum wage. Now, arguably in the past, this has been more a theoretical danger or risk to the organisation than an actual one. But I'd caution you on that, in that, well, on two counts. One is that HMRC are actively contacting small and medium-sized enterprises, including Volunteer Glasgow for that matter, in the last few weeks, to check that we are complying with minimum wage legislation. And secondly, some of the latest research stats, survey of volunteers across England, Wales and Scotland, the Time Well Spent survey, just very recently, has found that 26% of people that have recently volunteered in the last 12 months feel that their volunteering is becoming too much like paid work. Maybe inevitable, you would say, in the midst of a cost of living crisis. People being asked to do maybe more than they've been used to in their volunteering role. But nevertheless, if 1 in 4 are saying that they're feeling like it's becoming too much like paid work, clearly the risk to organisations around minimum wage legislation and the HMRC applying that to any payment you might give volunteers other than out-of-pocket expenses, the risk is largely where a volunteer might be motivated to contact HMRC to dob you in. So, food for thought if you get it wrong. Thankfully, however, there are published some really good, excellent guides to making sure that you don't get it wrong, and I'll give you the links to those in a minute. The third thing which is relevant to this question, what can happen if someone receives something other than just genuinely out-of-pocket expenses to the nearest penny, is a curious definition which is arguably unique to two departments in the UK government, the DWP and also the Home Office. And that's this definition that the DWP give here. And it makes the distinction between what is genuinely volunteering and what is considered by them to be unpaid work. And that's normally where that unpaid work is undertaking a role that would normally be paid, often in the private or profit-making sector. Again, I'll give you a link to this definition to the guidance. But this third area is where those payments that would otherwise be paid and to which someone would otherwise be entitled are treated as notional earnings. And again, the individual, there's a risk to the organisation if DWP were to determine that someone should be getting paid, because it would arguably be a role that is normally a paid employee role. So, moving swiftly on to the published guidance from DWP on volunteering. 3 statements there, and thought we might do a quick pop quiz. Hopefully you all know where your raised hand button is in Zoom. And I ask you to put that raised hand up if you think that that first statement is in fact genuine and true. You must tell the office that pays your benefits about any volunteering you're planning to do before you start. So if you think that's true, stick your hand up in Zoom. I'll give you a couple more seconds to think about it. 6 of you, 7 of you. How many have we got on the call now? Not sure. 9, 10. Whoa. Whoa. Okay, so I can reveal that that first statement is in fact true. And in fact, I can tell you that all 3 statements are true. So they're all direct quotes from the DWP guidance. Yeah, if you thought all of those were true, then well done. You're well on the way to actually getting it right. Again, I'll give you a link at the end to the guidance. not always as straightforward as people might think. The next slide tends to delve into some of the stuff that the more technical stuff. So we can spend a little bit more time on this in the Q&A and later. But again, all these three statements are in fact true. If you're not already familiar with the idea of a claimant commitment, a claimant commitment is the kind of agreed action plan between a work coach and a claimant that sets out the actions that someone's going to take to actively seek work and or get ready for work, depending on what is deemed necessary. It has to be agreed between the job seeker plus work coach, DWP work coach, and the claimant. But clearly there's a huge power imbalance relationship there. If the work coach isn't happy with what is being suggested by the claimant, ultimately there is the threat of sanctions, even if more recently, as DWP would claim, the use of sanctions is much diminished than it was maybe in the last 8 years, 10 years. So job seeker plus work coaches apparently are using sanctions a lot less. Nevertheless, the threat of sanction is there if a claimant doesn't agree to what the work coach deems is appropriate. We'll do a couple of worked examples of what the half-hour contribution of volunteering might look like in a minute. For those of you familiar with I guess changes in DWP benefits, increasing numbers of people are now on universal credit. Some of the so-called legacy benefits like ESA, which is employment support allowance, the number of people still claiming ESA is allegedly reducing as we go, and new claimants or new claimants that would otherwise in the past have been claiming ESA are now claiming universal credit. So different set of rules. And we've covered some of the expenses issues already, hopefully fairly clearly, but the third point there, DWP entirely comfortable with the idea that volunteers can be reimbursed for anything for which they're out of pocket as a result of their volunteering. But it's got to be to the nearest penny. A couple of worked examples then of the universal credit claimant commitment issue here. Jane's required to do 35 hours a week job search. In terms of her claimant commitment, she volunteers at a lunch club for 20 hours each week currently. Up to half of that, or up to half of her 35 hours can theoretically, if the work coach agrees, be spent volunteering if the work coach essentially agrees that the volunteering is useful in terms of her job search or her employability, potentially through development of skills, added element to CV, etc. So essentially that then means that of the 20 hours that Jane is already volunteering, 17 and a half of those hours can be counted towards her commitment to the job search. Obviously that then leaves 2.5 hours that she's got to volunteer in her own time outside of the 35. Second worked example, Joe required to do 21 hours a week for his claimant commitment. He volunteers at a playgroup for 8 hours each week. He can do up to 10.5 hours in theory if his work coach agrees volunteering as half of those 21 hours. He's doing 8 already, or he's only going to be doing 8. He's not intending to do any more. And that leaves then 13 hours in the remaining activities that he's going to have to agree with his work coach to do. So if you remember up top, I said that there was some questions remaining in relation to the work capability assessment. A little bit more in depth about that in a minute. But again, I can tell you that those two statements are both true. And again, direct quotes of DWP either on the website or the policy statement on work capability assessments and volunteering that they've provided, which is not published on the internet anywhere. The address for the DWP guidance that's published on gov.uk is there at the top. I will give you a copy, PDF copy of the DWP policy statement on work capability assessments as part of your handout pack. And we'll send you a link to that OneDrive folder with the 4 handouts after we've finished. The other thing that I mentioned earlier was that the best place, frankly, to go to for any volunteer management best practice is Volunteer Wiki, which Volunteer Edinburgh publish with some support from Volunteer Glasgow and others. There's 2 specific articles on that, which are listed there, one on volunteer expenses and one on volunteering and UK state benefits. Now, we've updated the UK state benefits in the last kind of 9 months or so, specifically in the context of the cost of living crisis, just so that people are crystal clear on what they can do to support volunteers in that context with expenses or in-kind meeting of expenses, if not actual payment. So without dwelling on the detail of that, there's some fairly short, succinct, but brief and detailed, comprehensive guidance on that. So there's really no excuse for getting it wrong. Okay. I'll give you a quick shufty at the guidance that's published on gov.uk, just so you know what it looks like if you've not seen it before. That, incidentally, is the minimum wage stuff. Oh, the Zoom bar gets in the way, doesn't it? Disaster. That's what the guidance looks like on gov.uk. And as hopefully you've picked up, that covers everything. It's generally quite positive and clear, but it doesn't address the central or the remaining question about work capability assessments. So I'm going to talk you through the work capability assessment stuff now quickly. What the DWP did in 2021, as I say, was produce a policy statement for the TSI network, the volunteer centres in Scotland, and address those outstanding questions about what impact volunteering might have on the outcome of a work capability assessment. And just to reiterate, a work capability assessment is the tool that DWP used to determine both eligibility and indeed the level of an award that someone might receive if they're claiming a benefit due to a long-term health condition or disability. Why is this important? Something of the order of about 280,000 people in Scotland, so over 250,000 people, do claim some form of benefit that's affected directly by a work capability assessment. What you've got the opportunity to do is provide individual volunteers or colleagues with either a hard copy printout of the policy statement from DWP, attach it to an email. What we're not allowed to do is publish it online, as I said. Last year, we undertook a survey of people directly affected by this policy statement on work capability assessments, and what you've got in front of you is the kind of headline results of that. Like any survey, there's limitations. In the case of this survey, one of the key limitations was the fact that we can't publish that policy statement anywhere online. So we had to invite people to email us from across Scotland for a copy of the statement that we could then attach as a PDF in the reply, and they were then able to comment on that and complete the survey. 70% of them said they were either fearful of what volunteering might mean for the outcome of a work capability assessment, or were unsure what the statement actually meant. Only 30% or less than 30% said the statement reassured them that volunteering would be okay. So clearly we seem to have a big potential problem. A couple of the quotes from those who were not reassured are maybe worth sharing with you. So the last two paragraphs of the statement from DWP don't reassure me in any way. I suspect if you can volunteer for anything, they will find you capable of work. And secondly, the necessity to explicitly declare voluntary activity to the DWP will always be a barrier and a prompt of fear to anyone wishing to undertake volunteering. Okay. So not an insignificant issue. Despite the fact that it's only one real question that remains unanswered, it impacts, as I say, on over 250,000 people in Scotland. So it's not insignificant. Finally, then, how can you guys support people who are receiving DWP benefits who may be volunteering with you? So you'll have two things. If you didn't already have them after today, you'll have a clear link and be able to provide and link people, signpost people to the online gov.uk guidance. You'll be able to provide people who are directly affected by the work capability assessment statement from DWP. You'll be able to provide them with a copy of that. And like a number of us potentially across the TSI Volunteer Centre network, one of the things that you might want to do is offer at least to provide additional information to work coaches or others about the volunteering that people are undertaking if the claimant, your volunteer, thinks that it might help them with the conversation that they need to have with their work coach. One of the questions in a work capability assessment is what does your typical day look like in terms of activities? And as no doubt many of you will have experienced, you might be managing a volunteer with a fluctuating long-term health condition. So what someone can do in supporting the work of your organisation through volunteering one week might be completely different, and they might be unable to do it the following week. So this question about, in a work capability assessment, about what's your typical day look like, or what activities do you generally undertake on a typical day, you can understand that is potentially could mislead an assessor if someone decides to include what they can do one week but not the next in relation to their volunteering. We've had colleagues across the Volunteer Centre network accompany people that they know well as volunteers to meetings with DWP staff. The issue with work capability assessments is that they're carried out at arm's length, so they're carried out by contractors. They're not carried out by the person who's decision or making decisions about your benefit. So very often in that context, it might be about challenging the outcome of a work capability assessment and supporting your volunteer to do that. By virtue of having an established working partnership with the DWP in Scotland, the TSIs, and me specifically, escalate an issue if we think someone in DWP, if a work coach or a decision maker is getting something fundamentally wrong that's in defiance of the DWP's own procedures or policy or stated ambitions, then we can escalate that to the head of partnership and employer working, the management team in DWP Scotland, to get it fixed. if you're familiar with social security reform at a UK level, I think in February, the UK government announced plans to reform work capability assessments. Goodness knows how long that'll take, but that's potentially very positive, depending on what it's replaced with. So opportunity, dangers, don't know. But in relation to that final point in the slide, yes, anything your organisations can do to, I guess, maybe alter the balance between what's reasonable and not unreasonable in relation to social security rules from the UK government, from DWP, would be very welcome, certainly from my perspective. The thing that kind of 10 of you were able to say, yeah, I think that's true too initially, is that final point there, which is this whole idea that any claimant, regardless of the type of benefit that they're claiming, the rule states that they need to declare their intention or their current volunteering to DWP. And those of you that are aware maybe of some of the work that's been going on in Scotland around human rights, there's a consultation currently out in relation to the Human Rights Bill at the Scottish Parliament, and the Policy Champions Network that's facilitated by Sarah at Volunteer Scotland is meeting in a couple of weeks to look specifically at, I guess, human rights and volunteering generally. So yeah, those of you that are attending that or might want to be involved in that, this clearly is an element that we might want to talk about and might want to challenge in future. Excuse me. That you'll be glad to hear is the end of the FBI PowerPoint. So if I'll stop sharing my slides at the moment. And David, we're good to go on a Q&A.
David, thank you very much indeed. That was a really useful and interesting overview of benefit system and volunteering. That was great. Thank you. And thank you very much to Joanna for popping up a couple of those links into the chat for people to access as well. We have got a couple of questions. I'm going to start with a really practical one, and I might have missed this. You might have said it already. Anne was asking if it was possible to get copies of the slides that you've been using.
Yeah, well, that's already in the OneDrive folder for sharing in terms of handouts. So
great,
no,
that's good. And the other question I've got here is it's from Amalia, and she's asking, is voluntary work the same as volunteering? I'm not sure if this is going back to unpaid work rather than volunteering. I don't know, Amalia, you might want to come in and clarify.
Right. So there's voluntary work, which is like a distinct sort of category in terms of home office and visas and all of that, to volunteering. And the difference is that there's a contractual element to voluntary work, which can allow you to a certain visa type. So it's always confusing me when anyone from the government says voluntary work instead of volunteering, if that means something different to volunteering itself. I'm going to assume that it's a no in this case, but I wanted to clarify.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been quite interesting to see how the Home Office guidance has changed, particularly for people seeking asylum. So those people who are looking for refugee status but haven't yet got it from the Home Office. So there's been an evolution of those rules over the last 20 years. They've improved vastly, it has to be said, but yeah, they still, I think, make a distinction between volunteering and voluntary work at the Home Office, which is not a distinction that the DWP tend to make in any of the published guidance. But yeah, I think you're right.
Okay, thank you.
They define volunteering as what we mean. So the definition that we looked at earlier in the early slides there, they treat differently from voluntary work. So their term voluntary work, if they still use that at the Home Office, is largely the same as the unpaid work definition that the DWP used that I put up on a slide earlier. So it's this idea that you can choose, i.e. voluntarily choose to undertake what would normally be paid work, but which isn't paid, and you're just choosing not to be paid, and the employer is agreeing and doesn't pay you. But if it would normally be a role that is paid, then both the Home Office and indeed DWP might treat it as notional earnings. So from a variety of perspectives, you wouldn't want to call that volunteering. In terms of, I guess, our practice as a volunteer centre service, we wouldn't normally promote any volunteering opportunity that would normally be paid work. It's very rare, if indeed ever, that any volunteer centre in Scotland would even promote a volunteering opportunity that's hosted by a profit-making private sector organisation. So, yeah, does that help?
It does. Thanks a million.
So, the only other thing I would add to that is that you hopefully all have seen the refresh of the 10 principles for I can't remember what they call them now, but I'll put those in the handout folder as well. The Scottish Trades Union Congress and Volunteer Scotland have for a number of years produced a charter which includes 10 principles to avoid exploitation and assure appropriate roles in terms of volunteering. And the 10 principles set out how organisations should operate in relation to what's volunteering and what's paid work. So if you've not already seen that, that's quite a useful thing to maybe to look at, just to make sure again that your organisation is getting things right. And very often, I guess, in relation to volunteer management and in terms of where that fits in an organisation, it might be a tool that you need to use to make sure that your governing bodies, that your non-volunteer specialist senior managers, to ensure that they help you get volunteering right. It's maybe one of the tools that you can use to ensure that you get that right.
Thank you very much. I see, Anne, you've got a hand up there. Does that mean that you've got a question to ask?
Yes, sorry if you don't mind. I maybe don't want to disclose too much to get different organisations into bother here, but it's something that I'm quite keen to get to the bottom of. There's a national sporting model, shall we say? That's all I'll say. That class young people and people who are in it as volunteers, but they are doing the same role as essentially other, people who are in. How would you view that? How do we get around that? And should it be changed to, if they, instead of call it volunteering, call it volunteering work, and therefore somebody has volunteered to do work for no pay? But is that then is an organisation therefore not at risk of very, very poor practice, because essentially they are getting somebody to do something for nothing?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think an organisation that's asking people to do something that is exactly the same, or includes a task or a set of tasks for which other people in the same organisation are paid, does risk some of the dangers that I posed earlier in relation to either DWP or HMRC. So yeah, I think they need to be careful. So the first place probably to direct them to is are the two volunteer wiki pages. There's in relation to the minimum wage application of HMRC stuff. I'll put a link in the chat to the current HMRC minimum wage compliance page, and you could direct people to that as well. I think, however, there's a note of caution, particularly in sport. I mean, what's acceptable in one sector, in one kind of, what might be acceptable in sport, particularly not-for-profit community sports clubs, might well be traditionally, historically acceptable and appropriate, but the same role in another sector, such as heritage or health and social care, for example, it wouldn't be acceptable. So there's a bit of a note of caution there. I mean, I suppose one of the biggest stats in sport, and this may or may not be the role that you're referring to, is coaching. So something in the order of about 60% of all coaches in sport across all sports in Scotland are volunteers. About a further 20% do some coaching on a volunteering basis, and some hours, maybe a month, are paid. And then there's about 20 to 30%, whatever's left, are paid coaches and only coach on a paid basis. Now, clearly, professional sport is one thing. The vast majority of sport is not-for-profit, largely member player-led sports clubs, and they run themselves as best they can. Where you've got a national governing body of sport, and that might be what you're alluding to here, who is arguably not getting things right, then I'd certainly, suggest that you signpost them to some of the stuff we've given you today. We've got very good links, including with the DWP issues, to the Scottish Sports Association, which is the kind of umbrella body for all the national governing bodies of sport. So there's a way of kind of escalating an issue there, kind of informally through back channels, if you thought that was appropriate as well. I'll put my email address in the chat, if I remember as well, but you'll certainly get it after. Is that okay?
Thank you, but yes, you might be surprised at the email, as it's something the referring body might be something that I'm alluding to, but that's I'll obviously expand in my email.
Cool, no problem.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And are there any other questions from anybody? No, that's fine. That's fine. Well, we will move on, coming towards the end of the session.